Welcome to the Commentary Magazine Daily Podcast. Today is Tuesday, September 3rd, 2024. I'm John Podhortz, the editor of Commentary Magazine. We have a full house today with executive editor Abe Greenwald. Hi, Abe.
Hi, John.
Senior editor Seth Mandel. Hi, Seth.
Hi, John.
Washington commentary columnist Matthew Continetti. Hi, Matt.
Hi, John.
And media commentary columnist Christine Rosen, whose new book, The Extinction of Experience, Being Human in a Disembodied World, we will be discussing later on this show. And throughout the week, the book is being released a week from today. So this is your chance to pre-order the book on Amazon or Barnes & Noble or wherever in order to have it in your inbox if you are a Kindle person that night, 12:01 a.m., Tuesday, September 10th. And we're going to tell you why, aside from your love and fidelity, love for and fidelity to Christine, you will want to buy this book, even though it's one of the most terrifying things that I have ever read. So just have that. It's like I'm doing a commercial here, like for Alien Romulus. It's like Alien Romulus, the scariest movie of the summer. You know, you may like Stephen King. Matt's read, I think, every Stephen King novel ever written. And this, as I said to Christine, her book, The Extinction of Experience, I haven't been scared by a book since I read The Shining when I was, 19. I've been scared by an actual book. So this one really scared me. So anyway, terrible.
Say hello to Christine.
Hello, Christine.
Hi, John. I'm not sure if that's a soft sell or a hard sell, but we'll
I think it's a pretty, I don't know, like when you say something is a book of social analysis and polemic has qualities in common with the best-selling writer, American writer of our time.
People like scary stories.
Yeah. Well, this isn't just a story. This is a reality that she is delving into. Anyway. So just to give you, we're slaking your, we're trying to stimulate your thirst for the conversation we'll have later. The conversation we'll have now, of course, I think has to start with the continuing fallout from the murder of the 6 hostages in Rafah over the weekend, and the absolutely gobsmacking phenomenon of the mainstream media, the Israeli left, and the British government, among others, somehow turning this into an attack on Israel for the crime of being the homeland of the people who were killed by the enemies of their state, by whom they were being illegally, unlawfully, monstrously, and torturously held for 330 days. I'm trying to think of an analog to this. Can anybody think of an analog to the experience of, I think it's like when people start getting angry at somebody.
I mean, I think October 7th is a pretty good analog.
Oh,
because what happened on the day of October 7th, 2023, or within 24 hours, you had an entire movement spring up throughout the West, including in the United States, blaming Israel for its own victimization. Right? Denouncing Israel, right. Saying Israel was responsible for the attacks of October 7th, even if Hamas was the group pulling the trigger. And something similar happened over this past weekend with the death of the 6 hostages executed by Hamas, apparently pretty soon before they may have been rescued by the IDF. And instead of placing the responsibility on the immoral agents who committed this atrocity, as you say, John, not just the media and the left in Israel and abroad, not just the Foreign Secretary of the United Kingdom, America's own president said yesterday, when asked if Benjamin Netanyahu was doing enough to get a ceasefire deal in place, no, he's not.
Okay, can I just bring one? I have to say this because now we are loosed to say what I'm about to say. Biden reputed to have given a one-word answer to the question of how do you, is Benjamin Netanyahu doing enough to free the hostages? Said no. Do we know what question he was answering? Do we know that he
Hmm.
understood the question? Because there was a follow-up moment, and then he said something like this, and then he walked away from the microphone. You cannot make out what the second thing that he said was. And watching him later in the day with Kamala Harris on this Pennsylvania jaunt, where he went into some bizarre story about his grandfather being accused of having been a member of a very it's a complicated story, but a sort of Irish terrorist group, thug group in the United States that was beating up union members the Molly Maguires, for reasons that it was extraordinarily hard, A, to follow, and B, made no sense because I don't think his grandfather was old enough to actually have been in the Molly Maguires when the Molly Maguires were active in Pennsylvania. Nonetheless, what he's doing talking about the Molly Maguires, he's not there. He is rapidly further and further from being there. That said, it's disgusting that he said what he said, and I don't want to excuse him.
But also notable that the White House
senility.
didn't walk it back.
Right.
Right. Typically,
Right. I mean, they've had
if
a
he does
day
say
to
something
do it,
incomprehensible, they walk it back or try to clarify. Not in this case.
Yeah. And also, the first report that came out blaring it was in Axios, which has been the White House's go-to place to leak stories and to push its view on a certain issue. And it would have corrected that if Axios had said something that was wrong.
The headline there and in the New York Times alert that I received was Biden criticizes Netanyahu for not doing enough to free hostages, that's doing a lot of work with the word no, is what I'm saying. In other words, what was brought to this by Axios, the New York Times, and apparently the entire world, was the desire to have a leading American official say Bibi Netanyahu is not doing enough to free the hostages at the same time or just after. I mean, Israel's 7 hours ahead of us, but there were demonstrations and protests in the street of Israel, which were, by the way, smaller than we had been led they were going to be. I'm not saying that they weren't remarkable and substantive and very important in terms of Israeli politics, but what had happened after the murders was that the labor union, the Histadrut, the public sector labor union, had declared a general strike for the country that most of the country did not abide by, and that it ended up shutting down the airport for 2 hours, shutting down the transit system for a little bit, different places in the country going to a standstill. Like my niece's daughter's nursery school took the day off, for example, as a form of general strike. And then a judge said, I'm sorry, you can't do a general strike in the middle of the war, and ended the whole thing. It wasn't as big as it seemed. And I also want to cite a poll by the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, a new polling outfit, that says that 49% of the Israeli people believe that Bibi Netanyahu is in the right, or that the pursuit of victory in the war of Hamas takes precedence over a deal to get the hostages home, versus 43% who say the hostages must be prioritized. Now, that is not the thing. Is, if you read the press here, you would think that it was 80% Israelis want to end the war or get a ceasefire in order to get the hostages home. Not that everybody in Israel doesn't want to get the hostages home, and that a few crazy right-wingers who also want to bring back the temple and create the red heifer and blow up the world with nuclear weapons, they're the only ones who think that Israel should pursue and finish this war and not allow.
You may have covered this on your emergency podcast the other day, but I think it's important to note what the hang-up is, what the United States, the UK, the Western European nations, and Egypt and Qatar want Netanyahu to do. What they want him to do is remove the IDF from the Philadelphi corridor, that is the border between Gaza and Egypt, at the outset of this ceasefire, to which I should add a ceasefire proposal 2 weeks ago that Netanyahu agreed to. Nonetheless, They want him to move further and say that the IDF will leave for 42 days. And Netanyahu, completely reasonably, is saying, if we do that, then Hamas and Egypt will resupply in order to have a next phase for war. Everything that we've learned about the Hamas terror tunnel network shows that its nexus, all the tunnels lead down there to Rafah and to the Philadelphia corridor, because that is clearly where Hamas is importing weapons and military apparel and infrastructure to fuel its war machine. And so we're in this bizarre situation now where every government, it seems, in the world is leaning on Israel to give up its point of leverage in this military conflict in order to potentially secure the release of some of the hostages who remain.
By the way, it's not just that it's a piece of leverage, right? It's not like my favorite show, The Odd Couple, where Oscar is able to pay Felix back for $900 he borrows because he hawks his saxophone, and Felix says, "I didn't know you had a saxophone," and Oscar says, "I don't, I just keep it for hawking." It's not just a piece of leverage to be traded back and forth. This is literally the last essential military target's not the right word, military possession that Israel has gotten control of, because it closes off. It's not just the resupply, but escape routes. It traps them in the tunnels.
That's right.
As Israel is trying to destroy the tunnels.
And can I follow up on that?
Yes.
Because at one of the points, and I believe Netanyahu made this point, but it could have been someone else, said that if Israel were to do this, if Israel were to leave the Philadelphia corridor at the outset of the ceasefire, then it's entirely possible, if not probable, that Hamas will spirit the hostages away.
Right.
Possibly even to Iran. So you're absolutely right. It's essential for security.
Right. They do not have the tunnel system fully mapped. According to last week, they said they thought they had 80% of it mapped, which is illogical as a statement, because that would mean that they knew that there were 20% more tunnels they had to find. And if they knew that, then they know where the tunnels are, and they would therefore be able to find them. So they don't actually know how extensive the tunnel system is yet. And there was a pretty remarkable piece in the New York Times, I have to say, about all the documentation that they have uncovered about Hamas and its tunnel system. It is now apparently twice as big as Israel thought. It may not be 250 miles of tunnels. It may be 500 miles of tunnels. And so if they pull out of the Philadelphia corridor, Israel literally doesn't know what escape routes they may have from the tunnel with the hostages, right? So that is a real thing. It's not just there's a cavalier line being laid out, which is, all right, so we'll pull back from the Philadelphia corridor. If we have to go back in, we'll go back in. That's how you do it. The point is, if you really do a ceasefire, right, you're out. You have agreed under international, whatever terms of your deal are, you're out. You're pulling out, and you're not there. That means you're not patrolling it. You're not driving trucks back and forth over it. You're out. Now, maybe you can use spy satellites to watch to see if the tunnels are being used, but
those are limited in a ceasefire. The terms of the ceasefire also say nothing flying over.
Right. Therefore, Israel will be blind to whether or not the hostages are spirited out.
And I would just say too, I'm sorry, Seth, but sure. I would just say too that going out and then coming back in is exactly the mow the lawn strategy that Israel pursued against Hamas for over a decade, and that ended up producing October 7th. So if you want to stop another October 7th from happening, Hamas needs to be completely and totally defeated. Right. And that requires an ongoing American presence, Israeli presence in the Philadelphia corridor.
Yeah, and leaving the Philadelphia corridor and then going back in at a later date, in addition to all the attendant difficulty of it, would be responded to as a new horrible Israeli provocation anyway. And would see
unless
all
something
sorts of,
so horrible happened,
even with
that the
something so
world
horrible.
had to say, no, but I'm saying the only way that doesn't happen is that something absolutely horrible happens.
Right. They left the Philadelphia
And therefore,
corridor
yeah.
18, 19 years ago, and they didn't go back in until October 7th.
Right.
Well,
And
that's
now,
the answer
right.
to what it would take for
Right.
there to be international legitimacy. And I just want to remind people what it means to say that Israel goes back into the tunnels. It's not the same as Israel going, quote unquote, back into Gaza, where they are firing from the air. Going back into secure the tunnels are booby trapped, and they are dark, and they are not, as John said, fully mapped. And what they've seen is that the Hamas has kept cameras there and IEDs, and they can remotely trigger them. And so part of the reason for the destruction above ground is because Israel, when they find IEDs, when they sense IEDs in a house, they can't go in. They have to destroy it because that's the entrance to the tunnel. So it's booby trapped with bombs. It's not, send Israel back in means sending individual soldiers into the pitch black bomb triggered dungeons.
Right. And it's important, again, this remarkable New York Times story makes the point that it is taking them far longer to destroy each section of tunnel than they anticipated because of all the need to protect those who are going into the tunnels, discovering that there are blast walls in some of the tunnels, discovering, that there are passageways that they did not anticipate there being. It can take a couple of weeks to destroy one section of tunnel. So imagine it takes a couple of weeks to destroy one section of tunnel, and you have 300 miles of tunnel left to destroy. At the very least, by being in and around there, you are retarding Hamas's ability to not only sort of its free movement around the tunnels because you're around there, but retarding its ability to fortify the tunnels in your absence, or to fortify their destructive capacity in your absence. And it's not just that they pulled out of the Philadelphia corridor 18 years ago and haven't been back. What is Israel's history with pulling back? In 1999, Israel pulled back from the Litani River in South Lebanon and left South Lebanon. And it is now 25 years later, and Israel is going to be, at some point in the relatively near future, engaged in a massive war in South Lebanon, because by leaving South Lebanon, Hezbollah became the effective occupier of South Lebanon and placed hundreds of thousands of rockets there that it has been firing on Israel now every day for 11 months.
I just want to say, if you even take Israel out of the equation here for a second, there's something surreal about this effort to confer international legitimacy on terror tunnels that go into another country's area. I mean, that's
You're
not a
absolutely
normal
right.
thing.
It's like conferring
Yeah.
international legitimacy on the Hezbollah rockets that are firing
Yeah.
from a sovereign nation.
I mean, we've
or
gotten to
Lebanon
such a
across-
crazy
you-
place.
Well, the
it's
international
incredible.
community paid for the tunnels. I guess they feel like they
Right.
should
Well,
defend
that's
their
true.
legitimacy.
Yeah, I mean, so now let's the cover that this argument is getting, it is getting from inside Israel, and to some extent from some elements of the Jewish community in the United States, though not importantly. So, right, Israelis are just in despair beyond despair, and there is a fight inside the Israeli government that is being waged between Netanyahu and his defense minister, Yoav Gallant. Now, when I say to you defense minister, I said this on the emergency pod the other day, but you start thinking of, like Buck Turgidson from Dr. Street, they want to bomb them back to the Stone Age. These military people, they're the ones who want to, in a movie, somebody in the uniform is always like the bad, the cowboy bad guy who wants to kill everybody, right? Gallant has for months, because he has been meeting with the hostage families, I think, on a weekly basis and stuff like that. I mean, I don't mean, I'm now going to say this in a negative way, and I don't really mean it quite, but his spirit is broken. He has decided that he can't bear that this cannot be borne anymore, and that the hostage release should be prioritized over keeping the Philadelphia corridor. He's the defense minister, right? Bibi is standing there in a giant argument with his defense minister, who is saying, I don't have it in me anymore to do what is necessary or to prioritize Israel's defense, which is actually my job. My job is to prioritize Israel's defense. Humanitarian questions about the hostages are not really in my writ exactly. That's not quite what I'm here. I'm here for battle plans and, contingencies and this and that and the other thing. But I'm standing here saying we need to get out of the Philadelphia corridor so we can get the hostages home. That's a very interesting dynamic. And the fact that we know this is happening has given fuel to demonstrators and others who in Israel have decided they can't take the war anymore, or they want to believe that there is this magical solution to getting the hostages home, which is a ceasefire deal that gets the hostages home. And that's what's important. And then, you know what? We'll deal with it after. We'll deal with the consequences of that later. If that means leaving the Philadelphia corridor, we'll go back in if we have to go back in. This is more important. And I'm not saying that is not an arguable it's obviously an arguable proposition. Pretty much half the country wants that, and half the country doesn't want that. So it's not.
The political dynamic also here is that people outside the Netanyahu administration see Gallant as a sort of representative of the outside on the inside. That's the dynamic that complicates this, which is that it's not just the Americans, but also the Israeli left. And, not to get into the details, but Bibi almost fired Gallant at the beginning of all this. And
which also wasn't about defense.
Right.
That was also interesting because that fight was about judicial reform, the judicial reform movement. And Gallant's argument as Minister of Defense was, this is very bad for solidarity inside Israel, the pursuit of this judicial reform. If anybody even remembers this, I don't even want to go into it, but his idea was people are going to decide they don't want to serve in the armed forces, or they're going to start boycotting the army. We can't have that. Suspend this deal. It's bad for the country's defense. There is no argument that he is making that the hostage deal, that keeping the Philadelphia corridor is bad for Israel's defense. That argument cannot be made. The argument is we need to get the hostages home, and that takes priority. That is not a defense minister's argument. It is a human's argument. It's an Israeli patriot's argument. It's whatever it is. But it's not, when you have somebody at the table, if you had the head of, the education system at the table, he would say we need more money for education, not, we need to do X, Y, and Z. Anyway, Israel's a parliamentary system. This is all very weird. I'm not saying otherwise. But the argument that Bibi and the Israeli government need to agree to a ceasefire to get the hostages home has two aspects that we should go into. One is that there is a deal to be had, meaning that the hostages will come home. The hostages are not going to come home. Or let's just say the bodies and the remaining hostages are not going to be released en masse at once or over a couple of days because Israel agrees to get rid of or to move out of the Philadelphia corridor and have a ceasefire in Gaza. How do we know this? Because nobody is negotiating as though those are the terms. If America and Qatar and Egypt said, okay, here's the deal. Every hostage comes out at 12 p.m. on Thursday, and in exchange, Israel is leaving the Philadelphia corridor and agreeing to a ceasefire in Gaza for 42 days. They're saying maybe 20, maybe 10, maybe 8 of them are Thai, maybe there are 30. We don't know how many are alive. We don't know how many are dead. There is no deal on the table, as far as we know, or that anybody is even advocating, that is even insisting that the basis of a hostage deal is the release of all the hostages en masse at once, as was the case in 1981 when the Iranians released the American hostages who were being held in Iran on the day of Reagan's inauguration.
This is where the American role has been weak and appalling, both at a moral and a political level. Because yesterday, or the day before, Kamala Harris did issue this very strong statement saying Hamas must be removed from power. This is terrible. I called the family of the American hostage who was killed, our condolences, et cetera, et cetera. However, follow-up questions that she was asked, she did not repeat that she thinks Hamas should be removed from power. And she still hasn't talked about the seven Americans are still being held by Hamas. The absolute memory hole. Oh, is it 4 now?
I think it's
the memory holding of these. I think it's men and one woman. Nobody knows their names. Nobody talks about them. And the leading candidate for the Democratic Party can make one brief statement, and then she immediately starts hedging again.
And can we just mention the performance of the leading candidate for our next vice president, Tim Walz?
Yes.
Who was asked about the murder of the hostages, including Hersh Goldberg, Poland, an American, while Walz was at the Minnesota State Fair chomping on a pork chop on a stick, I believe. And Walz heard the question, looked at the reporter, and then said, goodbye, turned around and walked and started pointing at random people in the crowd, which I think he has like an involuntary tic that he has to do. I think this was long before he even entered politics. Tim Walz would just walk around the town in Mankato, and just start pointing at random people and then putting his hands over his heart and looking at them. Somehow he found his life's work in politics where he could do that and be accepted in the community. But it was just a despicable reaction. The reason he couldn't do it, to Christine's point, was he didn't know what Kamala Harris's position on the issue would be. He hadn't received the memo yet.
And also, I want to say, regarding what Christine is saying about what Kamala Harris said and what others have said, similar things, it's not just a hedge. Kamala Harris has said Hamas will pay for this, and we need a hostage deal now. That's not a hedge. That's a paradox. Those are two different things.
Let me quote that because it's a tweet. I just pulled this up. I think it's important to get to the paradox or whatever it is. Today, this is September 2nd. POTUS and I met with the U.S. hostage deal negotiation team. The murder of Hersh Goldberg, Poland, and 5 other hostages was a brutal, barbaric act by Hamas terrorists. As POTUS said, POTUS being the president, Hamas leaders will pay for these crimes. It is long past time for a ceasefire and hostage deal. We need to bring the hostages home and end the suffering in Gaza.
So,
please. So, Abe, just briefly, the paradox.
Hamas will pay means Hamas will pay. We will get a deal means Hamas will get something. They won't pay. They will be
Hamas paid this morning.
Receive. Yes.
Hamas paid this morning again when a Nusra battalion commander was killed in a targeted strike by Israel. So Hamas is paying thanks to Israel.
Right.
They're getting paid thanks to everybody else.
Which, by the way, is fine. That's where this gets so upsetting. It is fine if the job that falls to Israel is to be the one to make Hamas pay. Where it's not fine is when international actors seek to intercede between Israel and its goal or retard the goal. Do I think that it would be great if America somehow entered this in some fashion to help? I mean, Richard Goldberg, who's written for us, who works with the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, has laid out a sort of 7-point plan, which is we cut Qatar off, we do this, we do that. Like, there's pressure we can put on the ancillary or the negotiating partners or the people who are facilitators of Hamas that we could do around it. Nobody is saying that America should directly engage in the punishment strategy of Hamas. Just leave Israel alone. or give them some intelligence if you can, or something like that. Don't attack the prime minister of Israel, who has agreed to your terms, by the way, which Matt alluded to. In his fight in the cabinet meeting with Yoav Gallant, and Gallant is saying we need to bring the hostages home, Bibi, in exasperation, we're told, in a leak that was intended to make him look bad, said, the Americans agreed to the position that we are now holding. Why are you arguing with me? I don't understand it. You know that we shouldn't pull out of the Philadelphia corridor. It's like, it's not even a question in terms of what we need to do to end the war on the terms that we wish to end the war on, with Hamas obliterated and not ever able to return to power in Gaza. The terms of the war, there's a claim that there were two goals, right? The goal was, one is to beat Hamas and to kill Hamas and kill it off. And the other is to get the hostages home. But, you know, those goals, as people have been finding it very hard to say, there's a point at which those goals, and they have come into conflict. Because if you state those as your open goals, you are telling Hamas how to make it impossible for Israel to succeed in the war. Keep the hostages. And part of keeping the hostages, as we've now seen tactically, can be to murder some of the hostages as Israel gets closer and closer to attaining its goal.
And can I clarify one thing for our listeners about the deal, by the way, just so we're clear?
This is not a deal, by the way. This was the bridging proposal of Tony Blinken.
But just
bridging proposal to a deal. But just
one thing to be clear about is that Israel announced that it had operational control of the Philadelphia corridor on May 29th. This was not something that started in October. So there's been a pattern of people going, oh, suddenly the Philadelphia corridor is so important to Israel. Bibi wasn't demanding it before. Just so our listeners are clear, Israel didn't have control of the corridor before. On May 29th, they announced control. On May 31st, Biden gave that big speech saying Israel has agreed to these terms. It's time for Hamas to agree, and that's that. And that's when everything started going haywire. Israel had agreed, and on May 31st, the U.S. and Israel were in alignment and had just taken operational control of the Philadelphia corridor. Everything that came after that was a Hamas reaction to a new situation in which they no longer had that strategic advantage.
The deal that I'm talking about, that Bibi was like yelling at Gallant about in this meeting, wasn't in May. That was 2 weeks ago, or 2.5 weeks ago, when Blinken, who did not want to do this, in my view, came out of the meeting with Bibi and said, well, he's just agreed to everything that we asked him to agree to. So now the ball is in Hamas's court. Blinken has said throughout the summer, the ball is in Hamas's court, because he is hearing from Israeli negotiators. He is not hearing intransigence from Israel. I just want people to understand this, though I think people listening to me, he has been hearing acquiescence and cooperation.
It's all
he is not the problem.
Dark, almost comic play that Blinken is performing in, because we had the Biden comment that Bibi isn't doing enough apparently to reach a ceasefire agreement. But then we had the parallel announcement from the administration, including Secretary of State Blinken, that the United States, Egypt, and Qatar are now embarking on the last ceasefire proposal we're going to do, the take it or leave it proposal. I believe, and I have not gone back, it was Labor Day weekend. I was trying to get some R&R. I've not gone back and counted. I believe we're on like the 8th take it or leave it.
It's the 9th. Okay. I think it's the 9th.
Yeah. Okay.
This is last and final. This is
the last and final. Hamas. We're not going to do. And what's the common trait among all of these take it or leave it proposals? Hamas rejects every one. And you can't get it through the State Department's, concrete facade that it's Hamas here that's the problem, not Israel.
I don't even know. This is where the president's condition makes this so hard to talk about, because one does not know the degree to which the president's infirmity has caused this bizarre cycle of return and return and return and return to the same point every week. Tony, go back. Negotiate a deal. So he goes, talks to Israel. Israel says, okay. He goes to Egypt and God, they're like, I don't know. We can't even reach Sinwar. Hard to talk to him. I guess we don't have a deal. Blinken comes back next week. Tony, go make a deal. Does Biden remember they told him to go last week? Tony goes back. Meanwhile, Biden's no longer the president effectively, or he's the president in all but name, or he's not the candidate or whatever. And now we have this new person who has no responsibility because she's not yet the president, but all of the authority, right? I mean, if Kamala Harris were to say,
the Blinken point is important because we know how involved he's been in all of the diplomacy with remember the Russia prisoner swap as well. He'd be standing next to Biden, saving discussions because Biden would forget things and Blinken was standing right there. And Blinken has been sidelined because Biden is effectively not the president anymore. In other words, everything has been revolving around Blinken. We used to hear from him. He would meet with the Israelis and then he would give a big press conference. And each day he would give a big press conference. And he's been the main conduit for that information. And even though he's still involved in the talks, obviously, Kamala is not going to retain him. And therefore, we're not hearing from him.
Right.
But I think this has actually been going on for longer than we might want to acknowledge, this triage effort by people.
I'm
like
happy
Blinken.
to acknowledge it.
He remember that image, that picture from Air Force One where Biden looked a little confused and tired and he was being asked questions by the press. Pretty rare event, actually, throughout his presidency. And behind him lurking is Tony Blinken with a look on his face of such anxiety and fear, worried about what the commander in chief might say about what he had just probably spent the previous week negotiating. That, to me, captured so much about what's going on behind the scenes that hopefully one day historians will unearth and describe in all of its various mundane horrors. But it's not just that he's now also, we have a lame duck Secretary of State. We have all of them are lame ducks if Biden isn't acting and Kamala is now de facto the one who's going to be assumed to be in charge.
Right. So if Kamala were to say today, she is not, but I mean, it is true. And Christine mentioned this, and I think we talked about it on the emergency podcast, that her statement is the toughest thing to come out of the administration since Biden's statements in October of last year.
Yes, it was tough.
The original statement was tough, and it was not qualified. And then she went on Twitter 4 hours later and qualified it in the way that I just read, which is they will pay. So here's a ceasefire deal and bring the hostages home. So we're in hell.
It's hard to be in a position of authority when you don't know your own mind and you're divided between different camps.
Also, do you know your own accent, Matt?
Well,
I mean, we have
before we turn to Christine,
I know
I just wanted to alert the American people to the most important news of the weekend, and that was Kamala Harris has a new accent, which she unveiled on the trail. Some people have likened it to Foghorn Leghorn, one of my favorite Looney Tunes characters. It's something that people really hadn't heard from her before, but the most amazing thing about the accent was that it vanished by the time she reached her next stop and spoke as we are used to hearing her speak in kind of her, Bay Area prosecutorial patois. But it was a reminder to me of Harris's essential phoniness and lack of confidence that she has to take on different accents in order to appeal to different audiences. There was also another bizarre kind of visual element to her campaign appearances yesterday, which is when she appeared in Pennsylvania alongside President Biden. They wore the same outfit. And they both had.
I noticed that. I'm so glad you said that.
Black like dark suits with blue shirts. And it occurred to me this morning they wanted to wear blue collars because it's Labor Day. I'm slow. It took me like 24 hours to figure
But it was
that
like
out.
take your daughter to work day or something.
But it was
They dressed
also
up
really
together.
kind of weird. And, Kamala Harris is a very attractive woman. This was not her best outfit. Like, she kind of looked odd in it. Having said all that, our friend Mark Halpern writes in his morning newsletter that probably the Harris campaign won the Labor Day earned media coverage, and he's probably right. But I thought I was just reminded of kind of between Walz's reaction to this, totally legitimate question at the Minnesota State Fair, and then Harris's sartorial choices in her bizarre accent during one campaign stop. I was reminded kind of like the potential weaknesses, that a strong campaign and effective candidate could exploit in order to stop the Harris momentum.
Well, that is an interesting aspect of all of this, which is that we keep talking about the silence of the Harris campaign, or like inability to talk about issues, won't be interviewed, and all of that. And I'm not saying that Trump is walking around not being willing to give interviews, although, of course, the big interview or the big moment of interaction between him and the press last week was a 3-day, swallowing a grenade that he then had to somehow, vomit out before it blew him up, which was I'm not going to vote for the, the
abortion. Florida
which he then hadn't understood the question.
Kind of flip-flopped on it, and then
well, it's
also
like he didn't
introduced
understand
his
the question.
Federally subsidized IVF proposal.
Yes.
Right.
Well, he has a town hall tomorrow. Right. He has a Fox town hall tomorrow, right? I believe that's tomorrow.
So he had a bad week, and it is not clear that he is on his game at all, and he's not on his game in a way that is particularly bad in relation to this stuff that we're talking about with Harris. So what is the thing about Donald Trump that everybody says, which is love him or hate him, right? He is defiantly himself. He is himself. He is authentically himself. He's not made up. He's not this, whatever he is, he's Donald Trump, and there it is. And she is and she is running as a phony. She is effectively saying,
okay, I want to push back a tiny bit on that, because she brought out a very slick commercial this weekend, and in it she doubled down on her "I'm going to stop price gouging that grocery stores do, and I'm going to bring your grocery prices down," really trying to hone her economic message in response to what voters have been saying for more than a year now about inflation and costs. But I was struck by the fact that everybody criticized her for the price setting idea, including economists who are on the left. And it's not just conservative economists who said this is a bad idea economically. And her choice, again, and it speaks to the condescension that Matt is describing in her adopting an accent when she's in Detroit, but not elsewhere. She is condescending to the American people by assuming that they don't care about the economic impact of price setting by the federal government, and instead just want a gauzy, Instagrammable message about how she's going to bring her groceries. Here I have to
disappoint you, Christine. She seems to be getting away with it.
I know.
So far.
I know. It drives me crazy.
And the worst part about it, though, it's not just the condescension; it's the cynicism. Because what did I read in the New York Times last week? A front page, actually a lead all in the Times, saying Harris officials are telling economists and people who are worried about the price gouging proposal, don't worry, it's not going to become law anyway.
Right.
Yeah.
So not only are they
cynical,
they're spreading this economic illiteracy as a means to win election, but they're also back channeling to their allies, saying, "Don't worry about it. We're not going to do it."
But the point that I was trying to make is that Trump. It's not that Trump is having an authenticity problem, but Trump is having an issue problem, because he is going backwards and forwards on things that, for somebody who has been in public life for 8 years, he should have fairly resolved, and therefore it's kind of he is on the back foot. If
he
what
doesn't
he wants
know what
to
to do about the abortion issue,
right?
I mean, that's behind all this.
Yes,
there are three issues in the election: economy, immigration, and abortion.
Right.
Trump's winning on two of them. He's losing big on abortion, and he's like the fried circuits, because he's
but
trying to figure out how do I get to a position where I'm not losing so badly on abortion, right. And that's put him all over the place. And of course, at the end of the day, he was never considered a pro-life advocate, so he's much more comfortable with his leave it to the states position, and have an abortion legal regime where there, that, as he said the heartbeat is too soon for him, right? The heartbeat bills. He thinks the 15-week is more reasonable. And then he always wants exceptions in the case of rape, incest, and the life of the mother. So that's where he is, and kind of translating that into a political rhetoric that can appeal to both swing voters, those suburban women that he's losing, and the Republican base is an impossible task, clearly.
Right. But I don't think it's just that. I'm saying that, and by the way, his margins, not on immigration, his margin on the economy is shrinking according to all of these issue-laden polls. Like, he was ahead of Biden by 20 points. He is ahead of Harris in single digits. He's going to need to ballast and shore that up. My point is, he is not who he was. He has not found his footing in this race against her. And if the thing that he can do is not only call her, too weak, too liberal, dangerously liberal, and all of that, but essentially point out that she is an incredible phony, which is actually a very successful argument to make, particularly against Democrats. One of the things that killed John Kerry off in a very close race in 2004 was the idea that he was a phony. He's not putting himself in the best position to do that. Now, we need to move off this because time is limited, and it is time for us to discuss The Extinction of Experience, Being Human in a Disembodied World, the new book by Christine Rosen, published by W.W. Norton. Christine, the key villain in your book, which is about life in the era of the internet, I would say, broadly defined, the key villain in your book is a word that you use frequently or throughout the book, which is mediation. That our experiences, everything that we do, we think, we say, we feel, we experience, we are now increasingly, there is something between us and that experience, and you call that mediation. What is mediation, and why did you scare the bejesus out of me reading about it?
Well, we use our technologies as tools, and we've mediated experiences since, someone picked up their first microscope or wore a pair of eyeglasses. What's different about the tools we use now are two things. One is their sophistication and their ability to read us, not only to expand our own senses, but to gather information about us, that some information we might actually not want to share. And also how we are starting to prefer those tools, the mediation, the screen to the face-to-face and to the real, and how that changes our moral universe, how it changes our interactions with each other, particularly in public space. And so we've seen, over the years, we've watched how people's norms and behavior have changed using cell phones, AirPods in their ears, all this stuff. That's been commented on before. But the thing that really bothers me going forward is that this is starting ever younger for our children, and it's cultivating habits of mind and behaviors that actually make it harder to get along with each other, because there are things we'll do. We know behaviorally that if you have a screen between you and another human being, you have something called an online disinhibition effect. You'll say and do things you would never do in face-to-face communication. So I worry about how it's contributing to some of the ways in which we've become a more polarized culture, a more isolated and lonely culture. And so for all those reasons, we are going to continue to use these tools. We all use them every day. I mean, we look at each other on a screen every morning when we do this podcast. We can't get away from them. But I think I want to urge people to deliberately choose to set it aside when you need to have that face-to-face time with human beings.
That's not it, though, because that's why the book is scarier than that, or more
I'm trying
disturbing.
To soft pedal it here.
Because you're talking about the experience, the way in which this is changing, not just our interactions, but our own experience of our own day-to-day, moment-to-moment existence.
We don't trust our own urges, our own feelings.
And that we are now living in a disembodied world. So that's your subtitle. So what do you mean by disembodied world? Because that's I think,
right.
Talk about the social costs, but this is now the cost to our very experience of life itself.
So people are starting to mistrust the signals their own body gives them. We are, if you study evolutionary history, you know that we've developed all kinds of ways of understanding ourselves and interacting with each other that are deeply embedded in our physical bodies. The way we read each other's faces, hand gestures, the inflection and tone of your voice, the way that we use our hands as tools to write, to do other things. All of these experiences are fading because we have these powerful tools which seem to do it better for us. And so what concerns me is that there is a kind of skills deterioration that happens. If you are used to communicating with people via text on your smartphone, it's going to be a different interaction when you're face to face with those people. For all of us, I think we all grew up hybrid. We didn't have these tools when we were younger and young adults, and we adopted them later. But that is not true for coming generations of people. They grow up with these. So those skills of being able to trust their own bodily reactions to things, being able to discipline one's own feelings of impatience, anxiety, anger, these are skills that we try to teach. We try to raise our kids to understand themselves this way. We are losing those skills. And as adults, we're seeing entire cohorts of people come of age lacking some of those basic skills and mistrusting the signs of their own emotional, particularly with emotions, trusting what their phone tells them they should feel more than what they are actually experiencing.
Early in the book,
one of the things that struck me, so you mentioned we're sort of one of the things that's being atrophied is the ability or the tendency or the inclination to daydream.
Yes.
Because you don't have, because you have your device right there, and to make use of boredom.
Yes.
Which is, I think, an important driving force in human history, actually.
Well, it's a huge reservoir for creativity. I mean, a lot of the aha moments that inventors and writers and human beings happen when that's why they have, you have the thought in the shower, or when you're on the bus staring out a window, or when you're walking down the street. But we fill those interstitial moments now with Candy Crush or checking our email or looking on, scrolling through social media. We fill that time. And so we're taking away those moments. And again, this doesn't seem like it would be that big a deal, but en masse, if we're all doing this, we become more impatient. We become bored. If you look at road rage and air rage rates, every year they get higher and higher. We are less patient and tolerant of each other as a result.
And at some point, you also talked about a specific example of what you mentioned before about having the devices do it for us, where you said there was an ad for a cell phone with a better camera, and it said, why learn how to take better pictures when the camera can do it for you?
Yes,
I remember thinking, like, I flashed back to my childhood where my grandfather, would sit with me with the camera, Polaroid camera or whatever, and he would say, pull your elbows into your body, squeeze your elbows in, take a deep breath, hold it, and squeeze the trigger. It was like I was shooting at a shooting range or something. The care, right, in how to take a good picture, because there was a limited amount of film, and that picture that you just took was going to come right out of the camera. And so, but it got me thinking about that phenomenon more generally. We're sort of, are we in danger of, like, fathers not teaching sons nearly as much, like the interaction part of learning how to do things also, which is like, well, I'll just look it up on YouTube and watch a video, and I know how to, like, my father taught me how to stand in the batter's box and how to hold a bat and how to square my shoulders and all that stuff. He taught me, how to shoot a jump shot, things like that. Are we in danger of getting to the point where even when people can do things, they're doing things because their phone is their guide, or, instructional videos or something they feel like they don't need, and you're losing that kind of, like, generation to generation passed down.
The skill. Well, it's interesting because on the one hand, and I have arguments with this with friends all the time. It's great to be able to go to YouTube and figure out how to do something, right? They show you how to, I mean, I figured out how to fix this weird glitch on my washing machine by watching YouTube videos. The people doing the videos, though, were experts at what they do. They were expert repairmen. They knew something. They were sharing this knowledge. That I feel like is something that I wouldn't argue against that. Just like I've had this argument with both Matt and John about, easy pass toll booths. Is it a genuinely good thing that we have that information? Yes, but you're right to worry about the way that these platforms are reading us while we're looking at the video, for example. So technologists in Silicon Valley see human beings as a problem to be solved. I see human beings as, with all of our problems, as exactly as we should be, and how the real challenge is working with each other, getting along, figuring out our purpose. So when you have the engineer's mindset and you look at a human being and say, they can't do all this stuff, let's outsource it to a technology that can, that's fine if you're just trying to, fix a minor plumbing issue. It's really problematic when we're turning to these tools to figure out who to fall in love with, who to, how to experience pleasure in the real world, where we should go on a trip and how we should experience travel when we're in a foreign place. All of these more existential issues and human issues, I think we're being encouraged to also outsource to those tools. And that's where I think we need to draw some lines.
Okay, we're gonna discuss this more, and I think we should move on. For tomorrow, we should talk about the question of how all of this is turning us into commodities to be exploited, that we are, without understanding it, selling ourselves as products for these companies that are limiting our freedom of choice without our even knowing that our freedom of choice is being limited. Anyway, The Extinction of Experience, Being Human in a Disembodied World by Christine Rosen from Norton, again, being published a week from today. Go to Amazon in particular. That's the best thing for us suffering writers, is to get a good Amazon number. Pre-order the book, get it, read it. It's a masterpiece. It's a book in the tradition of, if you were to look for a tradition, right? It's a sort of Amusing Ourselves to Death by Neil Postman, Jean Twenge's recent books. Jonathan Haidt's The Anxious Generation, which just came out, is like selling like hotcakes and deals with a lot of the fallout from this,
particularly for
extinction
children.
of experience,
Yes.
right? And so, but these large-scale social portraits of the ways in which changes in our social fabric from technology are altering the fabric of human existence without our ever being given a vote in some odd way to say, yes, this is fine, we'll go down this path. And if we like the Philadelphia Quarter, if we don't like it, we can just turn back or return back to base camp. And there is no base, because we've moved on from where the base is. And the question is, what can be reestablished or saved or superseded here? And we'll talk about that tomorrow. I want to make a quick weird recommendation before we go. I did not want to see it because I'd read the reviews. It looked terrible. I have my own experience of it. But my 14-year-old son really wanted to see, who is not particularly ideological, by the way, or like like following in my footsteps, but he really wanted to see Reagan, the movie with Dennis Quaid and Penelope Ann Miller. And I took him to see it last night. And I can't recommend it because it's ridiculous. And when I say it's ridiculous, what I mean is that it plays like a parody of a biopic of Reagan. Like, it's almost like if you were doing The Naked Gun and Reagan was the subject, without the comedy. But in other words, it's totally straight-faced, hagiographic portrait of Reagan as the victor in the Cold War. The entire through line of the movie is about how a fictional Russian spy who was in America to find out who who was going to be the sort of person who was going to interfere with Soviet efforts to dominate the world, whom they needed to watch. And in the early 1940s, he spots Reagan in Hollywood, and then you follow his explanation of how Reagan makes it to the White House and beyond. And Dennis Quaid is way too old to be playing the 35-year-old Ronald Reagan, to put it mildly. And it's very obvious and, as I say, almost comic in its heightened nature.
Did your son like
the reason? Yes, that's what I wanted to talk about. So my son, who was a New York kid, grew up, goes to the theater, has relatively sophisticated tastes. He was riveted. He was riveted and fascinated. It is kind of like so imagine it as a version of one of those like biographies for kids or teens. Who was Ronald Reagan? They see them in the store. And as such, I can recommend it, because if he liked it, I think a lot of kids will like it, particularly kids with parents who will not make fun of the movie afterward.
So I have a film recommendation for the parents who might make fun of the movie.
Okay.
So they take your child to see Reagan, teach your children well, have, recite the first inaugural every day, keep it in mind. But then for the adults, I have a recommendation. Yesterday, I watched the film Breaker Morant for the first time.
Oh.
And it's a masterpiece. And this is a film that's about 40 years old, about Breaker Morant, who I'd never really known the story of the Australian serving for the British in the Boer War, who are Morant is their commanding officer, but they're put on trial for war crimes, even though they were following orders. And the film is it's a kind of a military trial film along, the lines of A Few Good Men or Paths of Glory or Courage Under Fire. Better than Courage Under Fire. But I highly recommend it, Breaker Morant. And you learn a lot about not only the incident, which is a historic incident, but you learn a lot about.
He was a real person.
And one of the main characters, who was not sentenced to death, but sentenced to prison for life, but was released after 3 years, he went back to Australia and wrote a book about the whole affair, blaming the British Empire. And it is an amazing film to learn about how the British Empire worked, and learn about the Boer War, which is not well regarded or remembered or understood. And but as Breaker Morant says in the film, this was a new type of war. This was a war against irregulars. This was a war against essentially terrorists. Anyway, it's a great film, and I was rooting for the Aussies all the way.
That's fascinating. I haven't seen it since it came out, which I guess was like 45 years ago, and I remember everybody that I knew being blown away by it. It was part of this. Suddenly, out of nowhere, these movies are coming out of Australia. This was by the director Bruce Beresford. There were others made by Peter Weir, who later made The Truman Show and The Year of Living Dangerously and Dead Poet Society and things like that. And this continent of which we knew little, tens of thousands of miles away, which had only just in earlier years had been like releasing exploitation horror movies, suddenly starts putting out these one after another astoundingly good serious dramas, and Breaker Morant was one of those movies that introduced this world to us, and the fact that it can come from anywhere. And they're amazing central performance by the British actor Edward Woodward, who plays the title character, who ended up, for people who are old, you'll remember him as the star of The Equalizer, not Queen Latifah, but the really great CBS series about the rueful former intelligence officer, ashamed of the acts that he may have committed in the course of his career, becoming a kind of defender of the weak and defenseless in a crime-ridden, nightmarish New York City in the 1980s. And that's Edward Woodward.
Yeah, he's great. And just one point on that, I spent a lot of the movie thinking about contingency and accident in people's lives, because Edward Woodward looks and sounds a lot like Christopher Plummer. And of course, Christopher Plummer, who may be, I think they might be the same age, though Plummer might be a little bit old. He went on to megastardom. And Edward Woodward found the most fame starring for a CBS drama series.
Right.
And yet, what is really the difference between them? And if you watch Breaker Morant, it's hard to say, because the performance is so well done.
Yeah. So anyway, Reagan is something you should take your kids to if you are in general ideological congruence with us. They will be able to take parts of it that may strike you, a sophisticated adult, as being almost unbelievably overwrought or silly, or, as I say, almost self-parodic. And it will provide them with a kind of basic history lesson about the history of anti-communism. I mean, there's a line in there where Nancy comes upon Ronnie and he's sitting on a couch deciding to educate himself about the evils of the Soviets and everything like that. And she's like, "Do you like Whittaker Chambers more than me?" Because he's sitting reading Whittaker Chambers' Witness. Yeah, I mean, it's that level of dialogue and performance. Anyway, but nonetheless, and a really kind of delightful performance by ideological, by Hollywood's foremost conservative ideologist John Voight as the Russian who spots Reagan in 1940 as being the person who is going to destroy the Soviet Union, which is sort of how the movie casts itself. So if you're looking for something to use as a didactic piece of entertainment, this will serve you well. And we will be back tomorrow with more conversation about Christine Rosen's book, The Extinction of Experience, now available at Amazon and Barnes & Noble for pre-order. Until then, for Christine and Matt and Seth and I'm John Podhoretz. Keep the candle burning.